says time to go live? Okay. You ready? Tell me when we're live. Yeah? Good evening, good vach, and Shavua Tov. And welcome back to those who are in person. What a joy, what a pleasure, what a privilege. How exciting it is to be together. I'm going to open with words that I've never said in a Shabbos Shuver, Shabbos Hagadol Drasha in my life. Most years because it wasn't necessary. Last year because I was here alone. But this year I ask you, if you have a cell phone, to please turn it to silent or to turn it off so it doesn't interrupt us. I want to begin by thanking our generous sponsors, our dear friends, the Friedman and Cohen families, who sponsored this Shabbos Hagadol Drasha in loving memory of Rabbi Simcha Friedman and of Helen Cohen, two individuals who are not only your teachers and your mentors, who are biologically your parents, but who were sources of inspiration to all of us. We continue to draw from their energy, from their lessons, from their legacy, from their lives. They stood exactly for what we're going to talk about tonight. The notion, the importance of community, of caring about that which is bigger than ourselves, of a willingness to sacrifice, to be of service, that defined their very lives. We miss them, and we thank you for generously sponsoring in their memory. For those who are watching virtually, you can find the source sheets for tonight at RabbiEfremGoldberg.org/Hagadol, RabbiEfremGoldberg.org/Hagadol. For those in person or watching, feel free to follow in the source sheets, or if they're a distraction, as I tell you every year, just listen and read and learn and review them later. I want to welcome you, our beloved BRS family, and I want to welcome our BRS global family around the world who we've been privileged to connect with and to learn with throughout this pandemic. One of the benefits and opportunities it presented was to create and broaden our sense of community. And if you'd like to be part of that BRS global community, which includes bonus learning opportunities and content, you could visit brsonline.org/global. Take a moment with me to remember what it was like this time of year. The world as we knew it, the Jewish world in particular, was shut down. We didn't have any minyanim, not in our driveway, not in our street, not in our backyard, certainly not in this shul. We were utterly shut down. Everyone was isolated entirely from one another. There were people who spent the Pesach Seder unimaginably all alone. 1 year ago, we were divided, we were fragmented against our will and not by our design, because circumstances spread us apart. And it had a tremendous downside, the likes of which we will suffer from undoubtedly for years to come. People who I said spent the Seder alone. Last year I left my cell phone on and gave the number out that if anybody felt so isolated that they considered something drastic or dramatic, if they needed support, they should call. And I never imagined anyone would take me up on it. And imagine my children's surprise when they saw me. Several times over the course of last Pesach, on Yontiv itself answered the phone. And each and every time it rang, it was for a good reason. And I'm glad I did. Last year, that separation, that isolation, that apartness, there's no question it had an impact, as I said, that we will first begin to understand the PTSD as a result in the years ahead. But while it was a downside and while it posed countless challenges, it also presented opportunities. We learned and discovered things about ourselves, about our family, and about our community. How many of us found, when I daven at home, I daven with more kavanah. I move at my pace. I daven at the times convenient for me. How many described singing Kabbalah Shabbos together with their family? What a monumental experience to be with a spouse, with children, and to sing each paragraph. Every person became a chazan in their own home. Everyone was a gabbai in their own home. Everybody gave the drasha in their own home. Everyone was the president of their own shul. There were opportunities for each of us to run our house the way we wanted. We went for walks every Shabbos. We played board games and sang zmiros. We occupied ourselves not only on Shabbos and Yontif, but throughout the week in ways that we never did and we never imagined that we could. And so this pandemic, it's been a crisis. And it's been challenging, but it's also invited us for opportunities. Last week I attended a funeral of one of our greater community members, Tzvi Schwartzman, Olav Shalom. And his wife, Carolyn, at his funeral said, He died tragically young, and he was so generous to our shul and our whole greater community. But she really remarkably stopped at the funeral and thanked Hashem and said, Hashem, before you took him from me, you gave me a year that we spent together 24/7. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner together every single day. We talked all day. And she had the wherewithal to thank Hashem that in his last year of life, Hashem presented the refuah before the Makkah. He gave the opportunity that they spent all day together. But the challenge of these opportunities that we've discovered about ourselves and about one another is that now we've gotten very, very used to them. We've become very comfortable apart, comfortable staying home, comfortable where it's safe, not only physically from a virus, but in other ways as well. People are comfortable no longer making contact with one another. And source number 1 is an article, Missing Your Hugs, Why Touch is So Important and Can Mean Living Longer. In a recent poll, 60% of people questioned said they would no longer, going forward, greet people with a kiss, a hug, or even a handshake for fear of spreading germs. Now, personally, I could do without shaking hands ever again. I would be just fine. But if I didn't have the ability to hug one another, if we couldn't exchange energy, if we couldn't support one another in moments of grief and celebrate through an embrace and a moment of joy, what would life look like? And yet, 60%, the majority of people, we've gotten accustomed, we've gotten used to this new norm of this pandemic year, to physically be apart from one another. Now, it shouldn't be lost that Corona did for the laws of Shomer Negiah more than any seminary Rav or Rebbitzin, any yeshiva teacher could possibly do. But this is not good for us or our mental health. If you follow this article, studies over the past 10 to 15 years show the best predictor of your mental and physical well-being and health is the number of close friends you have with whom you do all the touching activities. Hugs have a communicative value. They demonstrate empathy. They are a powerful tool in reducing our stress response. And the article quotes the countless physical health benefits. When we hug one another, it releases endorphins, it releases hormones and chemicals that make us feel invigorated, it makes us feel better. And what will life look like if we've gotten used to that separateness and being apart? How many companies and how many corporations have announced excitedly and boldly that working from home, it's here to stay? I don't know how many of you have even gone to work, have put on clothing from the waist down in the last year, have attended a meeting other than over Zoom. It has been said that it's confusing. Are we working from home or are we living at work? We no longer know the difference between the two. And do we see that as a tragedy of circumstance that we're separate apart, that we're not able to meet someone at the coffee machine or the water cooler, that we no longer sit around a board table, that we no longer exchange pleasantries and small talk because every meeting is to accomplish an agenda and a task? And yet, Microsoft, Twitter, Square, Spotify, Shopify, Amazon, and countless others have announced new policies. They're shutting down offices and they're telling everybody, stay home and work from home. And the workers, employees are welcoming that news. But I wonder out loud together with you, is that good for us? Is that who we are and who we're meant to be? Is that the best of what we have to offer? Source number 3, the bottom of page 4, was a comment on an article. I want to thank my brother-in-law Benjamin, as always, for helping me research several of the articles in these source sheets. In this comment on an article that talked about people are now davening at home for the beginning, certainly, of the pandemic, and in some places we don't take for granted that everyone's in the same place in this story. People are still forced to daven alone at home. And the question is that tragic? Do we mourn it? Do we grieve it? Do we wish it weren't so? Do we long for when we can go back? Or like this commentator whose name online is staying home for good. I like davening at home. Faster, no tachanun, no mishulachim, and I start on time every day. There are benefits to being at home. You're never late when you daven at home. And nobody's coming by for some achnasas kala. Nobody's coming by to collect staka. And you never say tachanun, or at least that person thinks you don't when you daven at home. Joke's on them. But the people who are davening in their driveway or their front yard or backyard, who've come to love it and appreciate it and have find very redeemable things in it, I'm not criticizing. Has it become a new normal? Doctor visits over virtual, parent-teacher conferences on Zoom, no shaking hands and no hugging. Have we settled into separateness? And if we have, what does that mean for us and for our future? Is it the best of who we are and who we can become? Is it the healthiest way of living? That's what I want to discuss with you this evening. And perhaps in an unanticipated way, I want to share with you in our study of the history of the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice, the Paschal sacrifice, that I believe we can find answers through its history and laws for how we come back together again today. Now, we don't, of course, have a Korban Pesach today. Shabbos HaGadol Drasha I gave several years ago examined why not, and can we bring it back, and what would it take, or what are the reasons that preclude us from doing so. But for whatever reasons, universally, we don't have a Korban Pesach today. We don't bring a Paschal sacrifice, but we still invoke it, and we invoke it throughout the Pesach experience. The Shla Kadosh, Bishaya Levi Horowitz, the Shnei Luchos Abris writes, "Uneshalma parmas fasenu," the custom that many have, it's in source number 4 on page 5, quoted in the Eish Tamid Agada of Rav Druk. The Shla Kadosh says, this is why we recite the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. Some have the custom. In most years it's hard to do. There's so many activities and so many tasks and to do. But this year, Erev Pesach, Shechal B'Shabbos, we have all Shabbos afternoon to read the Korban Pesach. I don't know how many do, but where does this custom come from? So the Shla says, you know where it comes from? We can't bring the Paschal sacrifice, but when we read it and when we talk about it, Unesham Aparmas Fasenu, a pasuk in Hosea, then it's as if we brought it. Now it happens to be Rav Druk disagrees with the Shla, and the rest of this piece slugs it up and says, for the Korban Pesach in particular, reciting it's not enough, it can never take the place of bringing it, and that's why there are those who have the custom not in fact to say it. But you see that even before the Seder begins, there is already a custom to invoke the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice of the Pesach, by reading its story. If you look at page 7, 3 of the customs from the Seder night, the first is the Seder plate. On the Seder plate, those learning the Daf Yomi have recently encountered. On the Seder plate, we have Shnei Tavshilin, 2 cooked items, a Beitza and a Zeroa. We have the egg and we have the shank bone. Why are they there? They remind us of the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga. When you look at the Seder plate on your Seder table, you see what is a symbol that should remind us of the Korban Pesach. We have not moved on. We've not left it in the rearview mirror. The Hillel sandwich, Korech of Hillel, is a reminder of the way it was eaten. Amatzas and Merorim Yochlu. The Korban Pesach, it was a great shawarma. Ashkenazim, we eat the cracker matzah that plays with our digestive systems. But here's where, not only for kitnios, most people think the only reason you wish you were a Sephardi on Pesach is for kitnios. But they eat soft matzah. It's a lafa bread. So imagine you take some lamb, some mar, some charif, and you put it inside a lafa bread. It's called a shawarma. That's what Hillel ate on Seder night. He had a delicious Eish Tanur shawarma. We no longer have the Korban Pesach, the lamb element, the shawarma in the shawarma, but we eat that sandwich in order to remember the Korban Pesach. And of course the afikomen, we break the matzah in half, we hide half of it in order to remember the Korban Pesach that was eaten that way. Now the Korban Pesach is unique. It is distinct. It is entirely different than any other Korban, and in so many messages for us. Number 1, Ezu Makom, source 5. Some of you don't know it. I don't know, in the personal shuls, people are running out of their homes, whether they say korbanos or not. The ritual committee, that is each person's personal address. But at shuls, at least at one time, we began with korbanos. We recite the korbanos in fulfillment of that verse in Neshama Parmas Fasenu, that by reading it and reciting it, it is as if we did it. And in there we recite an entire chapter from the tractate of Zvachim, Ezu Mekomon, that talks about different sacrifices. And we talk about categories of sacrifices, and an exception to those categories is the Pesach. Ha-Pesach eino nechal ela balayla, eino nechal ela chatzos. We single out the Pesach because the Pesach has its own laws. In fact, the Rambam in his introduction to Hilchos Korban Pesach says 15 unique laws of this sacrifice, unlike the other sacrifices. So for example, other sacrifices are eaten either in the Beis HaMikdash proper, or they're limited. You had to consume from the barbecue that is that sacrifice somewhere in Yerushalayim. Kodshe Kodshim, the higher level, the more sacred sacrifices, can't be removed from the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. Kodshe Kolam, the lower, more lenient sort of sacrifice, is disqualified when taken out of Yerushalayim, because in that context, Yerushalayim is an extension of the Beis HaMikdash. So where you can eat the sacrifice reflects the level of sanctity of that sacrifice. Where's the Korban Pesach eaten? Where can the Korban Pesach be eaten? So let's go back to Mitzrayim. Let's go back to Egypt together. In that first year, in the year of the Exodus, when the sacrifice was first mandated. When Moshe told the people while yet in Egypt, have the courage and the bravery and the boldness and the resolve to take the God, the deity of your master, of your oppressor, tie it to the bedpost. 4 days later, sacrifice the God of the one who's held you captive for 210 years. That's called Shabbos HaGadol. It happened on the 10th of Nisan. We commemorate it every year with Shabbos HaGadol. And it was an amazing display of tenacity. The Jewish people, a slave mentality, a victim mentality, had the courage to take an animal that was the God of their master, to tie it to a bedpost, and ultimately to slaughter it. And God says, take of the blood and sprinkle it on the doorposts, and then atem lo tetzu ish mi Pesach beiso ad boker. You cannot leave your home until the morning. The night of Pesach, lockdown, quarantine. In Egypt, God says, everybody stay home. There's a curfew, lockdown order. Nobody can go out. Why not? Why not? So the simple reason why you shouldn't go out is because sakanas hamashchis. Because God is sending some energy, some agent who's going to slaughter the firstborn all over Egypt. There is a tragedy, calamity that's going to take place. It's not a night to casually wander the streets. You don't go for a stroll or a walk, because kevan shenite in rishus lamashchis eino mavchin bein rasha le'tzadik. Because once that force is out, when a natural disaster comes our way, Chalila, a hurricane, a tornado, a tsunami, it doesn't check the mezuzah on the door. It doesn't check is somebody a tzaddik or a rasha when they put themselves in harm's way. So the simple understanding was, don't go out because you're going to be harmed. However, Rav Druk points out in source 6 that the Mishnah in Pesachim, again those learning the daf recently encountered it, asks, Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Doros, what are some of the differences between the laws of the way we were first given the mitzvah of Pesach in Egypt, and then the way we were given the laws of Korban Pesach later when we came out? And one of the differences that is listed is this, staying home. Now, if the only reason you had to stay home was a technical reason, it's dangerous. If you leave your house, you could die. It is a very dangerous place to be that night, the streets of Egypt. Stay home, lock the door, put on the alarm. If that's the only reason, a technical reason, then why would it be listed among the things being Pesach Mitzrayim, the Pesach Doros? Says Rav Druk, there must be something so much more fundamental in the difference between the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice, the way it was offered that first year in Egypt, and the way it was offered subsequently. And what is that difference? What is the condition of Korban Pesach in Egypt? The condition of the sacrifice, the Paschal sacrifice in that first year different than subsequent years, and what is the message for us, for our lives, and for our homes? Look at page 9. Page 9 is the 12th chapter of the book of Shmos, the 12th chapter of the Exodus, of the book of Exodus. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol niyeh b'dvaro. I bolded one word. It appears 14 times in this chapter, at least, depends how you count. And what is that word? Bias. The home, a person's house. Sometimes it's used to describe the physical structure, the bricks and mortar. Other times, the people that live there and the energy that happens there. But the word that's used at least 14 times, over and over and over again, and clearly not coincidentally in this passage, in this section, is the word bias. Sela beis avos sela bias. Ushcheino akarov el beiso. Kahal adas Yisrael, we're going to talk about community. You take the blood, alabatim, sor mibatechem, bebatechem, lo tetzu ish pesach beiso, el beitechem lingof, the next page, al batei b'nei Yisrael, and over again. 14 times the use of that word. Why? What is the message about Pesach to our home and to our lives? Now it's interesting. Where's the blood of the sacrifice of Pesach when we offered it in Egypt? Where do you sprinkle that blood? On the doorway, on the home. Where is the meat eaten? It's eaten in the home. Who eats it with you? Preferably members of your family. In Egypt, one did not gather in groups. One isolated and quarantined. They created a pod. The Egyptians probably didn't, the Jews in Egypt didn't call them pods yet. They didn't know that we were going to structure life as pods. But you were a pod. You quarantined together as a unit. You can't leave your house. And why is it that you can't leave the house? So the Chizkuni in source number 9 says, you don't leave your house that night because we were supposed to leave Egypt to b'chipazon. We were in a hurry. We were leaving in an efficient, expedited way. So you don't meander to your neighbor. You don't say, hey, check out, try my shawarma. How's your shawarma? There's per capita more shawarma in South Florida than anywhere else in the world, including Egypt, including Israel. And when you ask each person who comes to RB and says, I'm opening a restaurant, I want to ask, oh, wonderful, what kind of restaurant? A shawarma. Are you aware of how many shawarma places? No. You never tasted my shawarma. So when is it that you go to your neighbor and say, you got to check out my shawarma? The secret is you never clean the spit. The secret is you leave it there overnight. Whatever the secret, everyone has their secret. You don't want to know the secrets. But you don't go to your neighbor, check out and try out my shawarma when you're in a rush to get out, says the Chizkuni. The Abarbanel says, it's dangerous. What are you going to flaunt in the face of the Egyptians? There's someone dropping dead in every one of their homes, and you're going to walk around and skip around, and you're going to go show off that you are safe and secure. It's a fool's errand. You don't do that. But there's a much more fundamental reason. The Meshech Chochmah says in source 11. The Meshech Chochmah of Meir Simcha of Dvinsk explains. And he says, you know why the bias, the home is so foundational, so fundamental, so central to the original Egypt experience? What happened when we left Egypt? We became a people. So one might think, we became a people, we are a nation, we are a tzibor, we are a community. Bye-bye home, see you later. I got to go to shul, I got to go to the Beis Medrash, I have to go to the board meeting, I have to go sit on the committee. I have so many things to take care of for the community. In that first year, when we were first formed, the message came across loud and clear. Do you know where the central place of Jewish life and living is? Stay in your home. Nobody could go out. Nobody could go out. Night Seder's canceled. The board meeting is canceled. The Tefillah B'tzibor, the late Marav, is canceled. The committee will meet another time. There is no other activity that night because the central place of Jewish life and living, where it must begin and where the story of our people begins, is in the home. The Meshech Chochmah writes that the obligation to stay in the home and to eat in a Chabura was a response to the pagans of their time who would sacrifice and offer their children. They literally sacrificed their children. But others metaphorically sacrificed children in the name of community and of peoplehood and of nation. And so the very first time that we celebrate Pesach, you know where the Beis HaMikdash is? You know what the Mishkan is? In the very first observance of Pesach, the place that is the holiest is the home. And everything that happened in that home follows the regular rules and regulations of the Beis HaMikdash. When you bring a sacrifice, you sprinkle the blood. In our home, we sprinkled the blood on the doorpost. In the Beis HaMikdash, there are boundaries and borders of where you can eat it. Where were the boundaries and borders of the sanctity of where you could eat that first Pesach? In the home. You couldn't take it out. It was disqualified if you left the home. And this was the very conversation that Moshe has with Paro in source number 12. When Paro's advisors tell him, are you crazy? Have we not suffered enough? Are you a glutton for punishment? Let him go. So fine. Vayushav es Moshe b'Aaron al Paro v'yomar aleim. L'chu ivdu as Hashem Elokeichem. Mi v'mi ha'ochim. Fine. Paro says, I give up. Take a break. You can go. Mi v'mi ha'ochim. Who's going? So Moshe said, who's going? What do you mean, who's going? Vayomar Moshe b'nareinu b'zkinenu nilech b'vanenu b'vneseinu b'tzonenu b'kareinu nilech ki chag Hashem lanu. What do you mean? We're all going. The young, the old, we're going with our sons and our daughters, our flock and our herds. Everyone and everything, we're all going. What's going on in this conversation? What does Paro think? He has oppressed his people for 2 centuries, and when he's going to finally let them go, what does he think? They're going to say anything other than we're all going? What was Paro thinking, and what does Moshe answer? So the commentators all explain, Paro was thinking, you claim you want to go out to serve God. You want to go out to be of service. So who serves God? The priests. So miva miha ochim. Give me a list of the rabbis, the rebbitzins, give me a list of the teachers, give me a list of the clergy. They can go. Moshe says, the clergy? What kind of religion do you think this is? The central place of religious activity is not the shul, the Beis Medrash. And the only ones who have to be religious are not the clergy, the rabbis, the rebbitzins, the teachers. Do you know who's going? B'nareinu, b'zkeinenu, b'vanenu, b'vneseinu. All of us. The young, the old, our sons, our daughters. Ki chag Hashem lanu. For us, Judaism is a chag. It's geschmack to be a yid. It's amazing to have Shabbos and to have Pesach. It's amazing the gift of discipline to keep kosher. It's amazing the interpersonal laws that regulate who we are to act like a mensch. What do you mean? We don't delegate to the priests or to the clergy or to the religious personalities or leaders. We are all going. Ki chag Hashem lanu. It's geschmack. It's a party. It's a chag. We're all there. And if anyone is missing, we're incomplete. Because that's the way Judaism was meant to be lived together, a family. You don't run out and you don't run apart. And so when we're first given this law of Pesach in Mitzrayim, we're given it in the context of a home, of a bayis. 14 times that word is used. And the bayis becomes that miniature mishkan, that miniature mikdash. The laws of Korban Pesach within the home parallel the laws later of Korban Pesach within the mikdash. This is a fundamental point. A slave has absolutely no control over their family life. A slave has to go out. A slave has to report. A slave has to show up. Paro, intentionally and by design, when he wanted to break the people, how did he do it? By enacting specifically rules and decrees against family life. Aside from murdering children, he tried it to divide. He tried to isolate the family because he understood a people is as strong as their family life. And so what was the response and the antidote? We emerged from Egypt rededicated to a strong family life. We emerge from Egypt understanding that the central place from which it all begins and which it must all spread is the health and the strength and the wellness of our home. That's where the story begins. And that's our religious experience. That's where pedagogically we teach that next generation. Source 13, we say in Shema every day. Everyone knows one of my favorite Divrei Torah. V'shinantam levanecha, we have to teach our children. So what do you go to Avos Sibanim, mother-daughter learning? V'shinantam, you have to teach your children, says the pasuk. Yes. But first, v'shinantam levanecha, you teach children. And how do you teach children? V'dibarta bam, because you speak about our values. And you live our vision. Where? B'shivtecha b'veisecha. When you're sitting at your home, what is the conversation around that dining room table? When you're sitting on the couch, what are you choosing to watch together? When the mail comes, what are the subscriptions and deliveries? What is being read? What images and what ideas are being invited into the home? Our children are watching, and they learn not only from our words, they learn much more from our actions. We can tell them what to do, but you know where they're going to pick the most up from? What do we do in our spare time and free time? How do we conduct ourselves at home? Do we make a bracha before and after we eat? Do we say thank you to whoever shopped and cooked that food? Do we get up to help? What do we watch? What do we listen to? How do we talk when they overhear us on the phone? Is the central place of learning. It is the first and foundational educational experience. And when we have mobility and when we're free to go up and about, where do we go on vacation? And how do we function on vacation? And do we find a minyan or a shul? Are we still scrupulous with keeping kosher? Do we make time to learn each day? Or does our Judaism stay home when we go on vacation? Are we taking a break from it too? Because our children are watching B'shinantam levanecha, all those tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of education are important, and our schools are outstanding and extraordinary. But the primary place of learning, of Vishinantam Levanecha, is B'shivtecha B'veisecha, what happens in our home. Certainly. But I want to share with you this evening that I think that the relationship to our home begins even before we talk about transmitting to children, because some don't yet have children, and we bless them. Those who want children should be able to have healthy, wonderful, beautiful children who give them nachas. And some have children who graduated their home, and they're no longer living at home. But the message of the home remains equally relevant for all of us, because the message is that our own Jewish experience doesn't sit in the kabi at shul, or our makom kavua at shul. It doesn't sit in our spot in the Beis Medrash. It doesn't sit in our spot where we volunteer for chesed. Our home is the central and primary place of our religious experience. It is where we are defined as who we are and aspirationally who we want to be. What we find and make time for. Are we generous? And do we share? And do we host? And do we help? Our home is what defines us. Source 17, the pasuk in Yeshaya, much more familiar to us from Yom Noraim time. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Such a beautiful interpretation I share with you in source 15. It means the following. What do you mean? Beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amim. Ki beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amim. A simple understanding of what the Navi is telling us is the Beis HaMikdash is a place for Jew and non-Jew alike. Non-Jews were also invited and welcome, and non-Jews could offer sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash too. And that's what God is saying. All are welcome. This is a place of faith. This is a place of love, Jew and non-Jew alike. But this homiletic interpretation, this beautiful drush, understands it differently. And it says, Ki beisi, my home, where I live, the roof over my head, beis tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. When it comes to the other nations and the other peoples of the world, the house is a place for mundane, secular base activity. That's where I shower and I eat, and that's where I binge watch Netflix, and that's where I read magazines and newspapers, and that's where I play board games. Oh, religious activity? I go to the religious place for the religious activity. According to most nations and peoples, they segregate religion from life. So I go to do my religious activities in the religious location, but when I'm home, that's a place where I chill, where I relax. It's a place where I do what I want, where nobody's watching, where I'm on my own, not a Jewish home. A Yiddish home is beis tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. If a non-Jew were to look at our home, just on Shabbos, it's Motzei Shabbos we just finished, and they would look and they would see, you washed and you made a bracha, and you made kiddush and you made a bracha, and you washed and you made a bracha, and you sang zmiros around the table while you're eating, and you shared homilies, you shared Torah messages, and then you bench, you say a blessing afterwards, and then you wake up, and this one's saying Tehillim, and this one's reading a Torah book, and this one's, they'd say, what is this, a church, a synagogue? What is your home? Is that your house, or is that a religious place? What's going on over here? That is our dream, and that's our aspiration, and that is our goal. Ki beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. That our home is a place of religious activity. It's not where we go to unwind. You don't literally or metaphorically walk through the doorway and take your yarmulke off. I'm done being a Jew. I'm home from Mariv. I'm back from Shacharis. I finished Shabbos. I finished my Chavrusa. I served on the board, on the committee. I volunteered in Tomchei Shabbos or Chesed. And when I walk through the portal of my door, now I'm done. It's the opposite. Out there should be a tangent. Out there should complement and supplement the religious activity I do in my home. And so when we first became a people and we first became a nation, and God said, offer your first Korban Pesach, I want you to do it in a way, I want you to set up your home to be the holiest place in the community. Your home to be the temple. Your home to be the tabernacle. You are the priests in your home. We are a Goy Kadosh, a Mamlechas Kohanim. There aren't just other priests. Oh, they have to be religious. They have to be righteous. They take one for the team, and I get to eat or say or do or marry whatever I want. That's not our religion. In our religion, we are a Mamlechas Kohanim. We are all priests in our own home. If we have children, but especially for ourselves. The home is the fundamental, foundational, central, primary place of religious life and living. That's why the Gemara Pesachim, Peiches, source 16, tells us, when the pasuk says, "V'alchu amim rabim ba'amru l'chu v'nalal Hashem al beis Elokei Yaakov," the nations say we're going to go to the house of God, to the Beis HaMikdash, to the temple. It is the house of Yaakov. And the Gemara wonders, the house of Yaakov, the God of Yaakov, hey, didn't we skip a couple generations? What happened to the house of the God of Avram and the house of the God of Yitzchak? Straight to the house of Yaakov? Yeah. You know why? Because Avram called God's house Har Moriah. He called it a mountain. And that's a pretty accurate description. It's a mountain. We try to climb it and aspire. We stretch, we reach. We try to climb the mountain of spirituality. But you know, you can't stay on top of the mountain. You got to come down. So that's not the best depiction. And Yitzchak, he called it a Sadeh. He went to go speak to God in the field. And a field is a place of planting and blossoming and blooming. A field is a place that generates growth. But you know what happens after you harvest? It lays fallow. It works in cycles. So that's not the best example. But Yaakov, what did Yaakov call it? Vayikra Hashem hamakom hahu Beit El. He called it a bias. Yaakov called the religious center of life. He described the Beis HaMikdash. If he had to come up with a parallel, he said it's a home, it's a house. And God says, you know, I like that. That's the most accurate description because it all begins in the home, says Rav Hirsch, that God himself endorses Yaakov's description of a bias, a Beis Elokim. It's a place of virtue and nobility, of honesty and integrity, of chesed and of learning, of generosity and of kindness. It is a Shar HaShamayim. Our homes are the gateway to heaven. Yes, the shul, and yes, the Beis Midrash, and yes, the volunteer chesed. But our home is the direct gate, Shara Shamayim, to heaven. Learning and growth and breakthrough does not take place outside. Pesach Mitzrayim was in the bias. Selabes avos selabayis. Sprinkle the blood in your home. And you can't take the meat outside of your home. Because our home is not just for eating and sleeping and entertainment and recreation. It's not just a place to store and accumulate and amass our things. It's not just a place so Amazon drivers have somewhere to go. Our home is a religious center. And if you want a small piece of heaven here on earth, if you want to welcome God in, if you want to feel His presence daily and regularly in your life, if you want a fertile classroom and a place of higher learning, then it begins in our home. It's what we say in Benchen. Haracham Yivarches Avi Mori, Vesimi Morasi, Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky wonders, but my father's not in Chinuch. My father's not a Rav or a Rebbe. My mother may not be an educator. So why are we describing them as a teacher? Avi Mori, Imi Morasi. Why are we describing them as a teacher? Says Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky. Because by default, automatically, every parent is a teacher in their home. The way we act, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we behave is transmitting much more directly than whatever we do with our mouths is what we do with our hands and our feet, what we do with our actions. It's the core definition and destination of religious experience. And that's what this year taught us. Early this year, we were all relegated only to our homes. Like that first Pesach in Mitzrayim, we were locked down. We were quarantined. We had a self-imposed curfew. Nobody can go out. Do you remember last Pesach? There was no minyan. Last Pesach, we thought if somebody would see me from a block away with 3 masks on, I'd drop dead. How far apart we stayed from one another. People were locked down. My parents and in-laws were each a block away, and everyone had Seder by themselves. It's unimaginable. 2 years ago, you wouldn't have believed me, and 2 years from now, even though we lived it, we won't believe that story. That people were a block away from others, and yet we remained alone. We remained alone in a bias, because that's perhaps where it all begins. And maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe the Almighty was reminding us to go back to basics and return back to the central place of Jewish life and living, and to go back into securing the boundaries of our home and realizing that Pesach and our Judaism and our Yiddishkeit begins at home. That's where it begins. Esther Jungreis, Rebbe Jungreis, tells a story of each day in Bergen-Belsen. They were given a ration of stale bread, a ration of bread. She says her father would hide a small piece with a great sacrifice. And her mother would collect the small morsels, and on Shabbos would approach, her father would gather and say, "Close your eyes." Would gather these children around and say, "Close your eyes, my precious children, and make believe that we're at home." Mama's baked fresh challahs, and the table is covered with a beautiful, pure, snowy white tablecloth. And the candlesticks are glistening, and we can bask in their glow. And there are angels all around us. And then he would begin to sing Shalom Aleichem in Bergen-Belsen, to begin to sing the words to Shalom Aleichem, to welcome the angels. So she describes that one Friday night, my brother tugged on my father's sleeve and he said, "Tati, we're singing Shalom Aleichem, but look around, look where we are. Look where we are. Where are there angels? I don't see any angels here in Bergen-Belsen." And tears rolled down her father's cheeks as he said, you, my precious and holy children, you are the angels of Shabbos." And she describes, "My feet were covered with sores, my head with lice. I was faint with hunger and I was freezing cold. But when my father said that, we stood a little bit higher. Because Hashem had bequeathed to us a precious gift and enabled us to soar upward. We became the angels of Shabbos." A parent has an ability wherever we are and whatever difficult circumstance or crisis to lock down as a family and to see one another as angels. To come together and to stretch and to soar upward. To be higher and higher and to be angels. But we don't stay in Pesach Mitzrayim. That was only the original in the very first Pesach, and we don't stay in quarantine or a lockdown. That is not the way it was permanently meant to be. A transition takes place, and I call your attention to source 18 on page 15. Later in the book of Dvarim, the Torah tells us that we go from the Pesach of Mitzrayim to the Pesach L'Doros. And now all of a sudden we're told, don't stay home, and don't sprinkle on your doorposts. And don't not take the food outside of your house. But instead, it's time to leave your house. It's time for everyone to come together. You started right. You have the foundation called your home. It is the central place of religious experience in life. Now, let's bring it out. Because we're not meant to live permanently apart and separate and isolated from one another. Now, let's come together. Where? Be drawn by Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem. Hashem says, come with me. You're not allowed to just offer the Paschal lamb wherever you want, but rather you have to come. So in Pesach Mitzrayim, in the very first time we brought that sacrifice, bias, house, home, stay home, forge your home, mold your home, build a home. And now that you have a strong and secure home, it's time to come together. It's time to create a community. It's time to be a people. Over and over again, b'makom, in the place I'll show you, in the place I'll show you. But we have a problem. Because there are millions of Jews, Baruch Hashem, came Yirbu, we should only spread and propagate and promulgate bigger and wider. But we can't all fit around a Seder table. We can't all spend Pesach together. We were just talking to somebody earlier today, Kenai Nahara, 32 grandchildren. Wonderful, we should all be Zocha. So they can't have all their children and grandchildren on Pesach together. Some the first days, some the second days. We can't all fit in one house. We can't all fit around one table. So the Jewish people are all supposed to come together to this place? It's Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem. How? It's physically impossible. How do we achieve that? So the Mechilta Rabbi Shmuel in source 19 tells us that the solution was the introduction of a new institution. And the new institution is called a Chabura. A Chabura. We're going to create miniature communities, subsets of the community, small groups of people who together will complement and supplement one another and forge this magnificent community called Klal Yisrael. True, we can't all be together. We don't fit in one house. We don't even fit in one hotel. But if we break up into chaburas, into small groups, subsections and micro communities, then we can still maintain the value of being a community. And these chaburas have laws. Source 20, the Rambam, just as an example, there are many more. About one chabura eating with another. If two of these groups are under one roof, they have to have a mechitza between them, a barrier between them. Everybody has to be on a roster. Everyone has to be registered. There's a minui, there's a registration process. You have to be accounted for. You have to be part of a community. Nobody can be invisible, and nobody can be isolated, and nobody can be marginalized, because that's not what Pesach is about. What our people about, and what the forging of our nation is about, is coming together, is a space and a place for everyone, is to ensure that everyone's invited to be part at least of a Chabura. So what is the nature of this Korban Pesach? And I know we're getting into the weeds of halacha, and it's late on a Motzei Shabbos, and I'll get the emails as I do every year. Just skip to the end where you tell the stories and get fiery and give the message. That's the best part. But listen, because I think this is a very, very important message. You don't think I want to skip to the end? This is an important message. The Rambam in source 21, in his introduction to Zvachim, the Mishnayos of Zvachim, the Rambam defines what a Korban Pesach is. He defines the Paschal sacrifice. He says, "Asugar avi korban yachad kein korban tzibur, v'hu korban Pesach." The Korban Pesach, this sacrifice is unique, is distinct. It's different than all others. It is a korban yachad, is an individual sacrifice, kein korban tzibur. It has an element of being a communal sacrifice, and yet it's offered individually and alone. What does that mean? So the Gemara in Yuma, source 22, tells us it's paid for by the individual. We don't collect all the money. The machatzisa shekel money doesn't pay for the Korban Pesach. Everyone's got to contribute. Everybody's got to go themselves and own a piece of that animal. If they're part of the minui, if they're part of the registration of that animal. Everybody has to be part of it. But it has to be brought together. Source 23, the Gemara in Zvachim. Even when we were allowed to offer sacrifices privately on private altars, what are called Bamos Yachid, there's a special law, a special prohibition that you're not allowed to bring a Korban Pesach on a private altar. Why? Because we're one people, one central address, the Beis HaMikdash. Everyone's not making Shabbos and making Pesach for themselves. Yes, we have to break up into Chaburas. Yes, we break up into small micro communities. Because pragmatically and functionally it's what we need to do. And we're surrounded by people we identify and connect with. But we don't do it to break apart from one another. We do it in order ultimately to combine and collect, to be together with one another. In source 24, Rav Neria describes so beautifully, and he quotes Rav Menachem Zemba, Hashem Yikom Damo. Rav Menachem Zemba was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, and he describes, just like when it comes to certain sacrifices, it is a communal sacrifice. Not everybody brings a Korban Musaf. One Musaf sacrifice is offered, and everybody fulfills with it. Everybody's Yotzei with it. Kain, Kach yesh chavas tzibur b'Pesach, shekol hatzibur yaviu Pesach, umikol makom lamatzinu sheyachiv lahavi Pesach echad b'yachad, mevara psachim shemeviin kol echad ve'echad, mishum shekevan she'Pesach osi b'kenufya, havi k'mo Korban tzibur. We combine and we connect and we collaborate all of those chaburas to be serving together as a Korban tzibur. It is unusual. This is the message of this holiday of Pesach. The transition from the way we spent last Pesach to the way we must spend this Pesach is exactly the way God first intended. Last Pesach, we went back to basics. Last Pesach, we secluded ourselves in our homes. Last Pesach, we discovered that I'm allowed to sing Hallel with my family in my home. That's a pretty beautiful Hallel too. Last Pesach we discovered I can be the Rebbe, I can give the Shir, I can teach the Haggadah. Last Pesach we discovered I can not only make a life I can tolerate or live with, but it can be beautiful. And I can discover wonderful things because that is the central place of Jewish life and living. In my own definition, that my Judaism religious activity is not only outside my home, but it's who I am and how I conduct myself. It's what I watch and how I eat and how I sleep. And everything I do within my home, that was last year. But then it's time to transition to a Pesach Ledoros. Not last year, which must remain an aberration. Last year was an exception. Last year is not a new normal. Last year is not on a pedestal or noble. Last year was tragic. Last year must be part of history. And now it's time to make destiny with a Pesach Ledoros. To be a tzibur, to combine and to collaborate, to commune and to collect. To come together the way Hashem first intended, the way it's meant to be. You know, there were Jews who couldn't participate in the Korban Pesach. And they came to Moshe and they said, it's not fair to us. It's not fair to us. No one in the history of mankind since then has ever said when they couldn't keep Pesach, it's not fair to me. They were the first and only ones who ever had, I don't have to make Pesach. But they came to Moshe and they said, it's not fair. Why should we be excluded? It's not fair. And Moshe consults with God and they're given the gift of Pesach Sheni. Look at their complaint a little closer. What did they miss? The cleaning? The cost of the matzah? Grinding the maror? What did they miss that they felt so excluded from? Why were they so desperately longing to have their fair chance? It's very simple, the words. Besoch b'nei Yisrael. They said it's not fair to us. We too want to be among the Jewish people. We want to experience this holiday as a nation, as a people, as a community, as a family. We want to be together. Rav Neria points out, he posits, against the Gemara Yerushalmi, he offers a third suggestion in source on page 18. Why is it that you're not allowed to have a Korban Pesach of just Gerim? Converts cannot say, you know what? We'll make a convert WhatsApp group, and when Pesach comes, we'll make a Korban Pesach, and the only ones who can register with our Korban Pesach are people who converted. Only converts can, a convert's Korban Pesach has a catchy ring to it. But they're not allowed to. It's against halacha. And Rav Neria suggests, you know why? Because this is not a time to define ourselves by our differences. This is the time that we come together and we integrate, and we collect, and we unite, and we become one. So the converts have to come together, biyachad. Kol adas Yisrael yasu oso. All of the Jewish people. And the convert is as much of a Jewish people as the one who was born Jewish. We are all together, and we're all united. And so the Korban Pesach has a set time and a set date. Tzibur, Klal Yisrael bring that Korban, but everyone has their own Chabura. Everyone does it in their own way, and everyone does it in their own style, and everyone does it with their own method. There's a beautiful Sforno and a beautiful Druk. You can take a look at it later in source 25. Rashi reminds us, the Gemara in Kedushin, this is in fact the source of the notion that we are responsible for one another. The whole institution, there was a beautiful Chabura this morning, Shlucha Shel Adam Kamoso. A person's agent or messenger can act on their behalf. One person offers the sacrifice for the whole Chabura. How does that work? Only one is bringing the sacrifice. We learn it from the Korban Pesach. Because we are united, because we come together, because we are one. That is what this holiday is about. There is no better time on the Jewish calendar to leave the neighborhood minyan and the driveway minyan and the davening at home in one's living room and to come back together as a community in a way that is safe for those who are able, indoors or outdoors, vaccinated, masks, all in ways that are safe within the comfort zone and with the sign-off of your own medical advisor. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But if there's no other reason, and I will tell you right now, and I could say this on behalf of Rabbi Moskowitz and my colleagues everywhere, how incredibly frustrating this year has been. How countlessly we encounter the very people who say, I can't come back to shul, I don't feel safe. Where are they telling you? While they're stuffing food in their mouth in the sushi line at the buffet at the simcha they're standing right next to you at. While their mask is down around their chin, I don't feel comfortable and safe at shul. Our own behavior is the biggest indicts us about what is really keeping us back to coming to shul. Is it safety, security, and health? Or have we grown comfortable in being apart? Has being separate become something which in fact we're more comfortable with? Pesach is the time to unite. It is the holiday of tzibur. It is the holiday of community and of unity. It is our forging of our nation and of our people. Yes, there was a place in Pesach Mitzrayim. It begins in the home. Bias. But there moves, it shifts. We leave the home. And where do we go? We go to a Chabura. We go to a tzibur. We go to be part of a people. The Maharal says this so beautifully in source 29. Pesach is Shehu Yisbarach Echad. Pesach is the Chag HaEmunah, it's the holiday of belief, of faith, that God is one. And if God is one, then we, His children, are one. And when we are fragmented and divided, when we are hypercritical, when we stay apart from one another, then we're not the one, we are not an extension of Him. And so the whole holiday of Pesach screams unity, togetherness, community of who we can become when we unite and when we are one. Source number 30, this is from a collection of diaries in the Holocaust and human behavior. And a young girl in this entry in the diary describes that the Holocaust and living in the ghetto life, living malnourished and living tortured and oppressed and living in fear and anxiety, it brought out a selfishness. It brought out a turning inward. She describes the fight, the yelling at her father, mother, cursing them out, that she could never imagine behaving that way, treating her own family in that manner. And yet in that circumstance and at that time, a slave, a captive, somebody who's persecuted or oppressed, only thinks about themselves and how they can survive. Freedom is the capacity to care about others. Freedom is the capacity to collaborate with others. Freedom is the ability to say, selflessly, I'll share what I have with others. My good friend Rabbi Chaim Strachler shared with me the Source 31 and the World, Prima Levy's book. If this is a man, he writes the story after liberation. When the broken window was repaired and the stove began to spread its heat, something seemed to relax in everyone. And at that moment, Tarowski proposed to the others that each of them offer a slice of bread to us three who had been working, and so it was agreed. Only a day before this would have been inconceivable. The law of the camp said, eat your own bread, and if you can, that of your neighbor. To do otherwise would have been suicidal. The offer of sharing bread was the first human gesture that occurred among us. I believe that moment can be dated as the beginning of the change by which we who had not died slowly changed from prisoners to men, to people again. When you're a prisoner, when you're captive, when you're a slave, not only do you eat what you have, but you try to steal and you try to grab whatever you can from others. But when you're a free person, then you share what you have with others. And he describes so poignantly that was the moment that they transitioned from prisoners to people. How did they know they were people, not prisoners? Because they were no longer just trying to survive and to grab. In the heart of Corona, when we were isolating from one another, we were prisoners to this virus and this pandemic. We were looking out for ourselves and trying to survive and get by, and that required us to be apart. But now we're free again. And that doesn't mean we don't have to be careful. BRS and everywhere else, distancing and masks and the regulations and all that we need to do in order to be careful. But if we want to prove ourselves, we want to break free from this pandemic, we have to shift our mentality from survival and selfishness to community and selflessness. Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote this, source 32. He writes about the Seder and the Chesed community. The meal as medium through which the individual breaking out of his encasement finds the thou, begins to address himself to him, who was introduced by Hashem in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Look at the next paragraph. People who spend time in the concentration camps during the Holocaust tell me, writes the Rav, that something similar dehumanizing happened to most of them. All emotions were extinguished, no compassion, no sympathy, no chesed, no concern for the thou, for the other stirred. Every human instinct, every noble emotion was nipped in the bud by grisly fears and horror. When they came back to the gates of the camp after 12 or 15 hours of work, the Nazi doctor used to look at them and classify them right or left. Right meant back into the cold barracks on an empty stomach, and left meant straight to the crematorium. There was no time to practice chesed. There was no time to experience the need for chesed. There was no time to be concerned about anyone else at all. There was only fright, one horror, one fear. Perhaps the doctor will send me to the left. And once the doctor said right, the prisoner did not care about anyone else. This is exactly what happens to a slave. Only free and proud people think of others and share with others. And that's why in the right-hand column he continues, a new fellowship was formed around the Korban Pesach. A new community sprang into existence. Being together, living with each other, sharing something many possess in common was made possible by the ceremonial of the Paschal Lamb. The halacha coined the term Chabura with reference to the group gathering together for this ceremony. Eating together is a great medium of communication between individuals, and therefore everything is shared. If you want to prove you care about others, we talk about breaking bread with another, sharing a meal with another, hosting another. Because when you share and when you host, you prove it's not only about you. And that's why we begin the Seder night with Kol Dichvan Yesev Yechel. Whoever's hungry, come and eat. I'm not a slave anymore. I don't have to grab everything from me. I don't have to live isolated from you. You are hungry? My door is open. Sit 6 feet apart. Wear a mask. Are you vaccinated? But my door is open. I'm not a slave in my mentality. I'm not owned by my possessions and things. I am a free person. And the evidence of my freedom is my eagerness and my willingness to share what I have with you. The Rav includes this again on page 25. The third norm pertaining to a slave is an inability to effect a marriage. Slave can't get married. Judaism apparently considers marriage not only a sociological institution, but a metaphysical existential community. To marry means to cut down the barriers that separate individuals from each other, to substitute for egocentricity and self-concern the bright spaces of joy and spiritual experience. Marriage is supposed to precipitate the transition from an individual to a communal existence. The slave can't be married. And while we marry with monogamy, but the Chabura represents our marriage to other people. A sense of community, that we're no longer slaves. And what is the greatest evidence that we're no longer slaves? When we're willing and able and eager to connect with others. That, my friends, is the message of Pesach. It's time. Daven outdoors, daven indoors, only if you're comfortable. But if you can't physically be together, let's spiritually be together. It's time to come back to be a community, to be a tzibur, to be united, to be a whole. But why, you'll say? Many people discovered within themselves over this past year talents and skills and energy and eagerness they didn't know they had. As I said before, some discovered I'm the chazan, I'm the gabbai, I give the sermon. At shul I was a nobody, I was invisible, I was a nothing. But in my home or on my block or in my neighborhood, I'm in everything. Shouldn't there be a space and an opportunity for the people like me? Why should we come back together? And why do we have to blend back in and integrate as one? What's wrong with being apart? Maybe we discovered a Judaism 2.0. Maybe there's a better way of being. So I want to end by talking to you about community and why it matters and why you matter and why the institution of community is the only way that we can plot forward and guarantee our continuity. Now, people used to belong to community out of conformity. My parents belong, my grandparents belong, I belong. It's what you have to do. You belong, you sign up for a shul. But there's no longer a pressure to conform to belong to community. No longer do you have to pay a membership or subscribe or be part of a community for that reason. But there's a much higher reason. is a much more noble reason to be part of community today, and it's not conformity, it's commitment. It's a reflection of where you see yourself and where you see your place. It's a reflection of who you care about and what you want to be part of. Are you a Chabura and you've turned your Chabura into a tzibur? Or are you a tzibur, but you're living and operating in one Chabura? And what do I mean by that? Pesach gives us this model. We're a nation, we're a people, but not everybody could fit around one Seder table. So we came up with the institution of the Chabura, these subgroups of registered people who ate the Korban Pesach and had the Seder together. They functioned, however, as one tzibur. They were collected together, as united as one whole. They were not apart or distinct or separate. True circumstances demanded that they operate in their unit, but they saw themselves as part of something greater. They weren't a tzibur competing with another tzibur. They were a Chabura complementing a Chabura to be part of a bigger tzibur. Our community, our shul doesn't have one minyan. We don't tell people you have to look one way. This is the yarmulke, this is the hat, this is the head covering, this is the dress. This is the nusach, this is the siddur you have to use. This is how you have to behave, this is how you have to educate your children. This is who you have to be, this is how you have to vote, this is what you need to do. Our community, and every Jewish community, should be made up of separate chaburos of people, of minyanim that are true to themselves, that are not trying to make everyone conform to one mold, but allow those differences to flourish and to emerge beautifully. But the minyanim have to come together to be one community, one kahal, one tzibur, one united whole. Not multiple tziburs competing with one another, living isolated and operating on islands by themselves. We have to come together to be part of something so much greater. Because Barov Am Hadras Melech, if we want to serve the Almighty God, when my children have to live apart, and they complement one another, but are they united? Are we a family? Do we function as a family? Are we loyal as a family? Do we stay in touch as a family? Do we have visions and a value and a shared destiny and a shared history as a family? Are we operating in silos? Are we operating independent in isolation? Are we operating in competition with one another? We, the Jewish people, are a family, and I'll tell you a secret, says Rav Hutner. We became a family before we got the Torah. When we recite a Birchas HaTorah, Asher B'charbona Mikol Ha'amim, V'nasa Lanu Es Torah So. We make a blessing. God, first, thank you for making us a family. And only then, after we're your family, did you give us your Torah. Thank you for making us a family. Thank you for making me feel part of a people. Thank you for having me be a covenantal community. Because, we all need it desperately. Desperately. What we can accomplish and achieve and the definition of who we are is elevated and enriched when we see ourselves as part of something greater, as part of something bigger. Berov Am, together and united, without having to forfeit and without having to erase our individuality. We can have different minyanim and different nischos and different practices and different styles, different ways of thinking, all to complement one another but not to compete, all to collaborate but not to take away. What is a football player without a team? A soldier without a unit, a drummer without a band, a violinist without an orchestra? What is a child without a family? We have a name for a child without a family. They're called an orphan. And a neighborhood minyan, a driveway minyan, I don't mean sanctioned and coordinated with the community, but I mean that wants to operate in the future in a way that competes with the community. It is functioning and operating as an orphan. A child without a family is an orphan. And they are the address and destination of our mercy and compassion, not something we look forward or long for. We are a family, and we are a people. We are a nation. We all have a longing for belonging. And this is the epidemic that's being unspoken about. It preceded this horrific pandemic, and tragically it looks like it will outlive it. Page 27 is an article from Time magazine that talks about COVID-19 is making America's loneliness epidemic even worse. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, public health experts were concerned about an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. The coronavirus has exacerbated that problem. Most face-to-face socializing for people still under lockdown. There is a loneliness epidemic. It's not listed in the DSM-5, the official diagnostic manual for mental health disorders, but it goes hand in hand with conditions that are. It's lumped together with social isolation, but the two concepts are different. It's not just social isolation. There are people who feel alone even in a crowded room. The damage on one's health from the loneliness is inestimable. People are losing years on their life. People are suffering health challenges from loneliness. There is an epidemic of loneliness that COVID-19 put a magnifying glass on and made it worse, but it is not only. It long began before it, and it looks like it will continue after it. And that's where community comes in. The antidote to loneliness is community, is to be together, is to be connected, is to be there for one another. To not say, why should I pay membership? I don't really benefit. I don't really go to the shul so much. Will the shul be there for you when you need it? When you have a shayla, a life cycle event, something to celebrate or something to grieve? Do you care about the youth department and the continuity of our people? Do you care about the chesed arm to make sure everyone has food to eat? Do you care about those checking in and those homebound, even if you're not benefiting directly from it? Do we want to connect with something bigger than ourselves? To dream aspirationally of a community of values that lives beyond ourselves? We are a spiritual family. We're not orphans who are living together in an orphanage. We are the definition of a new family who are living together. And if you'll say, well, I have my close circle of friends even during this pandemic. We stay together, we stay in touch, we sit in the backyard far apart from one another. So why do I need to come to shul? Why do I need to connect with community? Can't I continue to live this way? Page 30, source 34. And we're in the final home stretch, I promise. I read this Atlantic article, January, and it really shook me because it gave words to something I had been feeling, but I didn't know how to express. I don't know if you read this article. If you didn't, take this source book and read it. I think it is a brilliant, brilliant insight that gives a vocabulary to something that many of us are feeling. The author writes, Amanda Mull, in the weeks following, I thought frequently of other people I had missed without fully realizing it. Pretty good friends with whom I had mostly done things that were no longer possible, trying new restaurants together, co-workers I didn't know well but chatted with in the communal kitchen, workers at the local coffee or sandwich shops who could no longer dawdle to chat. The depth of intensity of these relationships varied greatly, but these people were all in some capacity my friends, and there was also no substitute for them during the pandemic. Tools like Zoom and FaceTime, useful for maintaining close relationships, couldn't recreate the ease of social serendipity or bringing back the activities that bound us together. Understandably, much of the energy directed toward the problem of the pandemic social life has been spent on keeping people tied to their families and closest friends. These other relationships have withered, largely unremarked on after the places that hosted them closed. The pandemic has evaporated entire categories of friendship, and by doing so depleted the joys that make up human life, and human health. But that does not present an opportunity. That does present an opportunity. In the coming months, as we begin to add people back into our lives, we'll now know what it's like to be without them. American culture does not have many words to describe different levels of types of friendships. But for our purposes, sociology does provide a useful concept. Weak ties. Weak ties was coined in 1973 by the Stanford sociologist Mark Granovetter, and it comprises acquaintances, people you see infrequently, and near strangers with whom you share some familiarity. They're the people on the periphery of your life. The guy who's always at the gym at the same time as you, the barista who starts making your usual order while you're still at the back of the line, the coworker from another department with whom you make small talk on the elevator. They're also the people you might have never directly met, but you share something important in common. You go to the same concerts, or live in the same neighborhood, frequent the same local businesses. You might not consider all of your weak ties friends, at least not in the common use of the word, but they're often people with whom you're friendly. Most people are familiar with the idea of an inner circle. Granovetter posited that we all also have an outer circle, vital to our social health in our own ways. Skipping down, friends are sometimes delineated by the way we met or the things we do together. Work friends, old college buddies, beer league softball teammates, but they're all friends. And rolling sticks up for the best. Living well isn't some cloistered retreat with just a few folks. The way worlds are created is by people sharing with and recognizing each other. Many different kinds of relationships are important, and man does not thrive on close friendships alone. Turn the page. The psychological effects of losing all but our closest ties can be profound. And this is the part that spoke to me. Peripheral connections tether us to the world at large. Without them, people sink into the compounding sameness of closed networks. Regular interaction with people outside our inner circle just makes us feel more like part of a community or part of something bigger. People on the peripheries of our lives introduce us to new ideas and new information, new opportunities, and other new people. If variety is the spice of life, these relationships are the conduit for it. And the conclusion on the next page. All of the researchers I spoke with we're hopeful that this extended pause would give people a deeper understanding of just how vital friendships of all types are to our well-being, and how all the people around us contribute to our lives, even if they occupy positions that the country's culture doesn't respect very much, service workers or store clerks. My hope is that people will realize that there's more people in their social networks that matter and provide some kind of value than just those few people that you spend time with and have probably managed to keep up with during the break. America, even before the pandemic, was a lonely country. It doesn't have to be. The end of our isolation could be the beginning of some of the most beautiful friendships. What is a community if not these close ties, if not these description of these relationships? They're the people you see every day at shul. You may not really remember their name, but you've been davening next to them or in the same room for years. Someone you sit with at the daf yomi or the shir that you attend or go to, someone you volunteer for the chesed with, who you see on a regular basis. And those peripheral relationships are the ones that we've lost and missed the most this year. Standing outside of shul and schmoozing with people, having the opportunity at a kiddush or a shalosh shidduch, standing on a buffet line or a shmorg at a simcha, those relationships matter. They contribute to who we are. They forge and they mold who we are going to become. They're important, and they don't happen at the edge of a driveway. And they don't happen in a living room. And they don't happen at a breakaway of self-selected people in a Chabura that lives in isolation and not complementing with others in order to create a tzibur, in order to be part of something which is bigger than ourselves. The peripheral relationships are what we need to overcome loneliness, but they're what we need to become the best version of ourselves. I shudder to think who I would be and who my children would be if we didn't live in a community where they were exposed to and close friends with Sfardim and Ashkenazim, and people who became religious through Chabad and Daven Nusachari, and those who connect with Karbach, and those who are still driving on Shabbos. This community that we are so blessed to live in and often we take for granted affords us the opportunity for those peripheral relationships, true and genuine and true close ones as well, but to connect and to learn and to be part of something so much bigger than ourselves. To not be orphans who are living in an orphanage, but to be a family that connected and collaboratively is living as a community. To be a tzibur made up of chaburas, not of chaburas competing to be independent and isolated tziburs. About 12 years ago, we had a terrible loss in our community. Some of you knew Margot Olswing, Aleh Shalom. Very, very special young woman who died around her 40th birthday. And her funeral was one of the most packed I'd ever seen the shul. And I'll never forget looking out, and even while I was delivering her eulogy, seeing people who I didn't think were friends or even knew Margot Olswing. And more than one of them, after the funeral, when I saw them later, I said, I saw you at the Levai, I saw you at Margot's funeral, I didn't know that you were friends with Margot. And more than one person said to me, Rabbi, I didn't know Margot Olswing, but the community experienced a tragedy. I wasn't not going to show up. That's what it means to be part of a community. There are celebrations and joys. There are festive highs where we want to be attached and connect and to be part of. And there are lows and there are tragedies. More recently, Brian Gaubit, Zichron Levracha, the shul, the campus was covered with people, not all who knew him or were close with him, but there are tragedies a community goes through that someone doesn't say, he wasn't in my Chabura. She wasn't part of my Chabura. We weren't registered in the same subgroup together. We weren't in the same social circumstance or social circle, so I don't need to go to that funeral, or I don't need to attend that event, or I don't need to step up to help that person. To be a tzibur is not to live only in chaburas, but to see chaburas that are part of a bigger tzibur. A couple of years ago, when our beloved custodian Theo passed away tragically and suddenly, and we held a funeral for his family. His African-American family gathered in the Boca Raton synagogue for his funeral. And we didn't know, would it just be our staff and his family? And you, our incredible community, showed up. Why? Because Theo was in your Chabura? You went out Saturday night for pizza with him? You got together socially with him? Because what it means to be in a Chabura, to be a community, a tzibur. Because Theo was part of us, part of our family. We show up. A couple of weeks ago, a woman texted Yocheved and said, so-and-so is not feeling well, had the vaccine, a bad reaction, you might want to check in. Yocheved texted back, how in the world do you know so-and-so? It's an older person at the periphery of the community, doesn't attend more than twice a year the shul. How in the world do you know them? She said, at the beginning of Corona, the community created connections of people who lived alone and others to check in on them. And I've spoken to her every single Friday since. And now I talk to her each and every week. Are they in the same Chabura? Do they have the same life or lifestyle? No. But they're part of one tzibur. It's what it means to be part of one community. It's what it means to be part of something so much bigger than ourselves. Yes, have a Chabura. Different minyanim and different styles and different approaches and different schools. No one is trying to make everyone conform or to look uniform. We value our diversity, but we celebrate our unity. We have to come together and be one, because you won't find these opportunities outside of community. It's what it means to be part of community. The Gemara tells us in Shabbos, I love this insight from Rav Kook. The Gemara says, any city that has homes that are taller than the shul, that neighborhood will end up being destroyed. A neighborhood that has houses taller than the shul, the neighborhood will be destroyed. In fact, this is codified lahalacha. The shul is supposed to be the tallest building in the neighborhood. And even with the knockdowns until now, BRS in this building is still the tallest building on Montoya Circle. Baruch Hashem, we are in fulfillment of this Gemara. But wonders Rav Kook, why? Why does the shul need to be the tallest building in the community? So that everyone from their backyard, the shul casts a shadow on everyone's home? Is it egocentric? Control? Is the whole drasha I'm giving because the shul and Goldberg need a monopoly and they need to collect the membership? Because how else will the rabbis get paid? So therefore they're preaching community. Because if everybody breaks away and everyone does for themselves, who's going to pay the salary? Who's going to keep the lights on? That's why he's given the drasha. Maybe that's your interpretation. That's not what Rav Kook says. Let me tell you what Rav Kook says. You can look inside on the last page 34. It's always a good sign, those words, the last page. Omer ha'olam eskayim ba'ashrosha shel adas ha'amita she'hamerkas ha'yoser gavoa v'nosei shebechayim u'kedushas ha'chayim l'shem Hashem yizbarach kol ma'asecha yu l'shem shamayim. What it means that the shul has to be the tallest building, it means that the shul has to be the merkaz. It has to be the tallest and highest center of what we all connect with. It has to be what draws us and brings us all together. It has to be something which is bigger and greater than ourselves. It has to be what we are of service to and what we want to contribute and to be part of. Because together we can do so much more than we can do when we are apart. Together, the difference and the change that we can make as a community. Dvarim shebekdusha, holy things can only be said b'tzibur, not b'chabura. You need to be a tzibur, a community, in order to be able to accomplish and achieve and preach holy things. The tshuva of a tzibur, the repentance of a tzibur, goes far above and beyond what the individual can accomplish or achieve on their own. To be a community of learning and a community of action and a community of love and a community of faith, a community of concern and a community of connection. Yes, we will continue to not only have chaburas, we are building more chaburas. As we come out of Corona, we learn more about ourselves and one another. We'll create more minyanim, as much as space will provide. And the plans that we had to expand this campus, that Corona put a screeching halt to, our shul, like many others, are no longer designing enormous, large main sanctuaries. But our future campus holds several smaller sanctuaries to recognize the need for different chaburas. You were the rabbi or the gabbai or the balkorei at your neighborhood minyan. You learned a lot about yourselves. Amazing, fantastic. We need you. Come home, come back. We have so much to do together. We have a space for you to lead. We have a place for you to make a difference. But do it together. Do it united. Do it as one. Do it as a community. The lockdown in Mitzrayim was one time, was Pesach Mitzrayim. But ever since then, we are at Tzibur to come back together, to grow larger, by more people moving in and to be a bigger community, but to grow smaller at the same time through the chaburas, the empty nesters, and the youth department, through our sunrise minyan, and through our runners group, and through each subgroup that we have. We want more. The incredible outreach and the Israel advocacy. The responsibility of each and every community to find that which speaks to people. We have big plans when Corona ends and is ending for service learning opportunities and for more empty nester experiences. We have enormous dreams and aspirations. All hands on deck. We need your help. Don't build in competition, build in collaboration. Don't have a Chabura which is competing with Tzibur, be a Chabura which is part of our Tzibur, united together as one. I want to tell you to end what it means to be part of a community that cares. Last year, Pesach, a family in Israel that was living in one community had a widow on the porch next door who was going to have her first Seder, not only without her husband, whom she had been married to for 60 years, but because of last year's circumstances, without her children or grandchildren, but utterly and entirely alone. Now this neighbor didn't know this woman, this widow. They were in a community together, but they weren't part of one Chabura. They weren't friends. They didn't run in the same social circles. They didn't overlap other than being part of one community. But they said, we have a neighbor next door, a widow, she's all alone. They came up with a great idea. And they said, why don't you set up a table on your porch, on your mirpaset, and we'll set up our Seder table on our porch, on our mirpaset, and you'll be able to listen and we'll effectively have the Seder together. You will not have to experience Pesach or the Seder all alone. So they did. And they had a magnificent, a beautiful Seder that went deep into the night in Israel. And when Pesach ended, as soon as it was Chol HaMoed, this woman called her children who she couldn't be with in person. And they said, how was the Seder? And she said, it was amazing. You're not going to believe this. You won't believe it. And the children said, what? He said, the family that invited me to sit on my porch on my mirpaset and have the Seder, do you know that they have the same minhagim? They have all the same customs as us. And each part we got to of the Haggadah, they sang the exact same tunes as us. They sang the same songs. And so I felt that even though Abba's gone, and it was my first Seder in almost 60 years without him, I felt like I had the Seder with your Abba, because they did everything exactly the same. And the children began to cry, and they told their mother how happy they were, because they knew something that she didn't. What they knew was that this neighbor, that week before, had determined to call all the children of that woman and to find out the minhagim and ask them to record all the tunes that she was used to hearing so they could produce for her as close to a Seder as she had experienced all those 60 years. That's what it means to be part of a community. It's to be so thoughtful. It's to care. It's to step up. It's to show up. And if you live in a Chabura and you say, she's not part of my Chabura, I don't know her and I'm not responsible for her, then that woman experiences that Pesach alone. When you're part of one community, what we could achieve and what we could accomplish and where we can go and who we can be, the sky is the limit. And so I end by offering and extending this invitation. I do so on behalf of my colleagues, even though they didn't ask me to, and I don't know they want me to. But we turn to all of our communities and we say, come home. Come back together. Let's collaborate. And let's take what we've learned about one another and ourselves and let's use it. Let's use it to be there more for one another. Let's use it to be better together. Let's use it to strive higher together. Let's use it to go farther together. Let's use it to achieve more in the world of outreach or in our love for Israel and a difference we're making in Israel. Let's create more learning opportunities and more Talmud Torah in more diverse ways. Let's reach and teach and inspire our children in ways we never have. Let's serve our members in ways they all deserve. Let's be true to ourselves and remain in our Chabura. But let's continue to reach up, to reach in, and to reach out together as a tzibur, wishing everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.